The Weekly Wisconsin on November 26, 1856, reported the following statement by Le Lyonnais fireman Nestor Fabien. Quote, "We heard the concussion, but we did not know what it was. In 5 minutes' time, the water came rushing into the engine room, carrying the coal along with it. The fires were put out almost instantly. A number of us were engaged all through the night trying to stop the leak, but all to no purpose, and at last we were forced to go on deck."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Long Fight of Les Lyonnais.
Here we are. Enjoy!
Les Lyonnais was a very new ship, having only been completed for Gauthiers' Franco-American line in the spring of 1856. Les Lyonnais was one of 6 ships that the Franco-American Company had ordered for their brand new line, which had also been started that year. It was their intention to establish a line that would connect Havre, France, which they were based out of, with the United States and Brazil. To accomplish this, they purchased 6 new iron-hulled screw steamers of 2,500 tons, Les Lyonnais being among this number. Les Lyonnais was intended specifically for the South American route, and completed 2 voyages to Rio de Janeiro before she was placed on the New York route temporarily for her 3rd voyage. Les Lyonnais reached New York under the command of Captain Deveau without incident, and at 2 p.m. on the 1st of November, 1856, she departed New York for her return voyage to Havre. There were around 150 people on board between the passengers and crew, including 39 cabin passengers. By nightfall, they were entirely out to sea, and they were making good time for a ship of the era. Second mate Laguerre estimated that, thanks to calm weather and a good breeze, they were going about 10 knots, and that they were a little over 100 miles from New York at noon on the 2nd. The waves had been a little rough on the first night, and many of the passengers had been seasick, and therefore there had been very little socializing. But the second had turned out fair, and the passengers had spent a pleasant day socializing and getting to know one another. The mood was good on board the ship as night fell on the 2nd, with the cabin passengers entertaining themselves by playing the piano and singing until it got late, and they dispersed to their cabins for the night. The night of the 2nd had turned out to be a dark and foggy one, as the ship traveled about 60 miles from Nantucket Lightship. Those on board had no way of knowing that another ship was about to cross their path. Another new vessel, the American bark, the Adriatic, under the command of Captain Durham, had departed from Belfast, Maine on the 31st of October, and was headed to Savannah, Georgia, with a cargo of lime and hay. It was not the practice of the Adriatic to show a light at all times, but as a sailing vessel it was also not required by any laws in the United States that it should do so at the time. Captain Durham did say that after his lookout called out the lights of a steamer coming towards them off their weather bow, he did order that a signal light be placed in the mizzen rigging about 15 feet above the deck, and that it was. This having been done, the Adriatic continued on her course. By his estimation, Les Lyonnais should pass across the stern of the Adriatic without incident while this course was maintained. The Adriatic, according to Captain Durham, was traveling under double-reefed topsails, but they reported that up until the end, Les Lyonnais was traveling under full sail, and also seemed to be full steam. Second mate Laguerre of Les Lyonnais disagreed with some of these details. He would state that the lookout on board Les Lyonnais had called out that the bark was traveling full sail to starboard, and on a collision course with them. He would state that they never saw a light from the Adriatic at any point, and it was only when the collision was imminent that they realized there was another ship nearby. Les Lyonnais had had a whistle installed while in New York, but that was intended to be heard for a 10-mile radius, and that was sounded now while the helm was put hard a port in a last-minute attempt to avoid the other vessel. According to Captain Durham, this was watched with horror on board the Adriatic, since he would say that this was exactly what brought the two ships into a collision course. The Adriatic now put her helm down, bringing her head into the wind so that she was almost entirely stopped now. According to Captain Durham, this was the only way he could prevent the larger and faster vessel from running down his ship amidships and sinking her immediately. Second Mate Laguerre would state that the Adriatic had struck them in his testimony, and Captain Durham would say that Les Lyonnais had struck them in his. The Adriatic had her jib boom, bowsprit, and starboard bow carried away by the steamer. Also among the wreckage that was found on board Les Lyonnais was a part of the figurehead of the Adriatic, a black dragon with a gilt mane and red eyes. While the Adriatic remained hove to try to assess her damages and patch anything that needed to be patched before she continued her voyage, the people on board her watched as Les Lyonnais continued on her course full speed, as though nothing had happened. Seeing Les Lyonnais not even pause in her voyage, Captain Durham assumed that the vessel they had collided with was not badly damaged. Captain Deveau also seems to have been under this impression initially. He rushed to the ship's wheel as soon as the two ships collided, but does not seem to have taken any other immediate action. In truth, Les Lyonnais had been fatally wounded. The Adriatic had struck amidships and had stove in the side of the steamer from the companionway to the shrouds, as well as damaging two of the steamship's boats, one of which was a lifeboat. The iron plates of the coal bunkers were broken away, and water now came rushing in. For 10 minutes, Les Lyonnais was able to continue on her course before the water extinguished the fires in the engine room. It would be Chief Engineer Genu who would come up on deck and report to the officers that water was pouring into the coal bunkers, the engines were flooding, and the ship was sinking. The officers of Les Lyonnais did take a moment to look back to see the ship that they had collided with, but they could no longer see her or any lights, and they assumed that she had sunk immediately. They expected no help from that direction. At first, they put the pumps to work to try to combat the rising water, but the floating coal and cinders soon blocked up the pumps and rendered them unusable, so they were forced to resort to a bucket chain. The hole was on the waterline, and some of the passengers and crew went to work shifting the cargo from starboard to port. But when this failed to have a large enough impact on the rising water, Captain Deveau ordered that the sacks of grain that made up the majority of the cargo go overboard. What happened to the $20,000 in specie that the ship was also carrying was never mentioned, though it seems doubtful that this joined the grain in going over the side. While they were trying to bail the ship out by hand, two of the passengers who were retired sea captains joined a few officers and the sailors in covering the hole in the ship with a sail. In the meantime, the ship's carpenters worked from the inside to try to plug the leak with mattresses and bedding. The waves were now growing rough again, though, and the pressure was too great for the bedding to withstand. It was estimated that a dozen mattresses had been employed, but the water was still gaining in the ship. The number of watertight compartments that Les Lyonnais had varies by account, but the captain of the Vigo consort ship of Les Lyonnais would tell the newspapers that she had 7, and that if 2 had held, she would have remained afloat. This was clearly not the case, and perhaps the solution to this mystery is held in an engineering magazine published sometime later, which used Les Lyonnais as an example of how imperfect the building of watertight compartments was in iron vessels and the room for improvement that remained. Since the water was still gaining, they now tried covering the outside of the ship over the hole with a large awning, which seemed to be more effective. In spite of this seemingly stopping the whole well and their continued bailing, the water was still gaining. And those on board were forced to acknowledge that there was most likely another hole somewhere below the waterline that they could not see. They continued the attempt to bail out the ship until 3 in the afternoon of the 3rd, when everyone was too exhausted to continue. The ship was clearly not going to remain above the water for much longer. Her stern was settling lower and lower in the water. Captain Deveau had been preparing for this eventuality. He called the officers into the pilot house and showed them the charts, telling them to steer for Montauk Point once they left the ship, which was the nearest land. Throughout the day, a raft was built made of spars, cabin doors, boards, chicken coops, and anything else that seemed usable. On it was placed 2 barrels of wine, 2 puncheons of water, and food sufficient for 50 people to live on for at least a month. As the order to evacuate was given, 40 of the passengers went on board the raft, mostly believed to have been steerage passengers. Into a cutter was loaded navigational equipment, as well as provisions for 2 weeks, and this was placed under the command of Chief Officer Rousset. This boat carried 25 people, a majority of whom were cabin servants. A second cutter loaded in the same way, and also with 25 people on board, was launched under the command of the 2 retired sea captains who had been on board as passengers. Third Mate Duplat took command of the lifeboat, which had been damaged during the collision but was still considered usable. 18 people were loaded onto this boat, as well as the same 2 weeks of provisions and navigational instruments. Second Mate Laguerre was placed in command of the second undamaged lifeboat with another 18 people in it and 2 weeks of provisions, though they did not have any navigational equipment. Once loaded, the boats remained near the sinking Les Lyonnais through the night. Captain Deveau, his first mate, and 9 others remained on board the sinking ship through the night, though they had 2 6-person yawls on standby in case of emergency. It was not a night without incident, though Captain Deveau was not forced to evacuate his sinking ship in the darkness. The already damaged lifeboat, under the command of the third mate, was carried by a wave against the raft in the darkness and sunk immediately. The people on the raft were able to save the people in the water, but they lost the supplies and navigational equipment that had been in the boat. At 7 in the morning on the 4th, Captain Deveau realized that Les Lyonnais was not going to remain afloat much longer, and he gave the order to take to the yawls. Captain Deveau was the last man to leave his ship as was customary, and he stated that he would not depart until he saw her sink below the waves. The raft remained with him, tied to the sinking ship, but with a man standing by with a knife to cut the rope before they were dragged down. The other yawl, with the first mate on board, also remained with the captain. The 3 remaining boats began their voyage together, and the last that second mate Laguerre saw of the Les Lyonnais was her stern below water and her bow beginning to rise. The 3 boats remained together until a heavy fog set in at 5 in the evening, and they were separated. Second mate Laguerre tried to find the other boats, but he was not able to, and he was forced to continue without them. He was now forced to steer the best he could without access to any navigational instruments. Their luck would not get any better. At 9 at night, the foggy conditions would turn into a full winter storm. For the next 3 days, they were forced to run before the winds. The waves crashed over them, spoiling almost all of their water and provisions. Everyone on the boat suffered from the cold after being pelted with hail and snow, as well as the frigid seawater. Before the storm had passed, they had lost 2 of their number. one of them a fireman from the engine crew, and the other a passenger. Both men had succumbed to the cold, and the remaining people on board were forced to consign them to the sea. On the 6th, they saw a schooner, but they could not reach her due to the heavy waves, and she did not see them. On the 8th, they saw another ship, and they tried to row towards her, but she also did not see them. As the ship was traveling north, they decided to follow her and see if they could be noticed. On the morning of the 9th, their luck changed. Though the ship they had been rowing after never turned back, they saw another ship heading in their direction, and they rowed to meet her instead. This ship they were able to reach after 3 hours of rowing, and they were picked up by the bark, the Elise of Bremen, which was headed from Baltimore to Bremen. The Elise took them as well as their boat on board, and they were treated with care and kindness. The only problem was the Elise was headed to Bremen. It was, therefore, fortunate that on the 10th, they encountered another vessel named the Elise, which was traveling from Hamburg to New York with German immigrants on board. The two captains spoke, and the survivors of Les Lyonnais were transferred to the other Elise to return to New York. This was with the exception of Mr. Scheller, the former vice-consul for Britain, and his wife, who both stated that they would rather go on to Bremen. On the evening of the 14th of November, the group was once again in New York City. All of them would require a long time to recover after their ordeal, all of them having large patches of frostbite. Second mate Leguer, having served in the French Navy previously, had seen action on both land and sea, quipped to the newspapers that, having now experienced a shipwreck, he only needed to experience an earthquake to render his catalogue of sightseeing complete. Second mate Leguer did not have much hope for the raft. It was his belief that it could not have lasted through the storm they had experienced, and it had most likely broken up. He had high hopes for the other boats, however. He used his own boat as an example. He felt that, in spite of the conditions they had been faced with, they could have held on for several more days, especially since the people in his boat had remained in good spirits and hopeful until the end. This opinion was not shared by passenger Flora Solomon, who told the newspapers that she and the other young woman on board the boat were almost at their limit, being poorly dressed for the conditions and with their feet in freezing water the entire time. Still, with the hope that more boats could be found, the steamer Marion was quickly dispatched to search for them, and other ships sailing in the area were told to keep their eyes out for boats. 2 more boats were eventually found, both belonging to Les Lyonnais, and both empty of people. In his optimism, Second mate Leguer had overlooked that his boat was the only true lifeboat that had remained when they had left Les Lyonnais, and it had clearly weathered the storm the best. The 16 people on his boat would be the only survivors out of the 150 who had been on Les Lyonnais. The mystery would remain. What was the ship that had struck the French steamer? Second mate Leguer was not able to tell anyone the identity of who they had collided with, and with his statement that he believed the other ship had immediately sank, there was much anxiety about what ship it could be. The Adriatic, meanwhile, had no idea of the damage that they had done, and the tragedy that had transpired. On the 4th, soon after the time that Les Lyonnais was being abandoned, the Adriatic put into Gloucester, Massachusetts for repairs. Captain Durham submitted a report of the collision as he knew it, which was published in Belfast, Maine, but thought nothing more of it. His report of a collision with an unknown steamer was so understated that it went completely unnoticed by the world at large. It would not be until the 16th that the news would reach the New York newspapers that the other ship in the collision had been the Adriatic. Captain Dunham, meanwhile, had his ship repaired for $2,000 and continued on to Savannah, Georgia with his cargo. In Savannah, he loaded a cargo of timber that was bound for La Ciotat, France, where he arrived on the 10th of February, 1857. By the 20th, he had discharged his cargo, and after paying his custom dues, prepared to depart for Sicily. He was therefore surprised when one of the customs officials came to him the next day and told him that there was a mistake with his paperwork, and that he needed to come to the office so they could sort it out. It was only once he reached the office that he was informed that they were holding his papers and detaining his ship and cargo. The Franco-American Company, on learning that the Adriatic was in France, had gone to the courts and demanded damages for the loss of Les Lyonnais, saying that the fault of the accident lay entirely with Captain Durham. The detaining of his ship and cargo was directly as a result of this. There was no American consul at Ciotat, and so Captain Durham was forced to go to Marseille to make a complaint. In the meantime, the Adriatic had the rudder unhung and the rigging removed so that she could not escape, the first mate of the vessel being told by the French authorities that if they did not comply with the order of the court, they would be arrested. Captain Durham did not accept the fault for the sinking of Les Lyonnais, and he brought the case before the Tribunal of Commerce of Marseille, where it was decided in favor of Captain Durham. The tribunal examined the signal that Captain Durham had showed, and since it was in a proper position 10 minutes before the ships had struck one another, they found no fault with his light. They also reported that Les Lyonnais had violated the rules of the road by putting her wheel to starboard when trying to pass another vessel. As for Captain Durham, abandoning a sinking ship, the tribunal found no fault with him for this either, since the Adriatic was at an almost complete stop after the collision, and it had been Les Lyonnais which had not stopped. It would not have been possible for Captain Durham to have any knowledge of how damaged the steamer was in such a situation. It was a tragic accident, but nothing more was the ruling of the tribunal. The Franco-American Company was not satisfied with this ruling, and they took the matter to the appeals court. In the meantime, the Adriatic was brought to the port of Marseille, where it could be better guarded. The appeals court overturned the decision of the tribunal on the basis that, since Les Lyonnais had not been able to see the signal light on board the Adriatic, it was clearly either insufficiently bright or improperly placed. The Adriatic was declared to forfeit, to be sold along with her cargo to reimburse the owners of Les Lyonnais. There was also some concern that Captain Durham might be arrested any day for the remaining balance of the value of Les Lyonnais with this new decision in place. Captain Durham began to plot the escape of both himself and his vessel. Another American ship named the Maher was also in port and being detained, in this case due to heavy debt that it had incurred that its captain, Captain Smith, was not able to pay off. The two captains conspired, and the Maher was soon brought alongside the Adriatic. The Maher's cargo and rigging, as well as some guns, were transferred out to the unrigged Adriatic in the middle of the night. At 3 a.m, the Adriatic sailed out, telling the watchman who called out that she was the moon. A French cruiser was dispatched after her, but the Adriatic was able to evade capture, and the Adriatic arrived in Savannah on the 18th of March, 1858. The matter would turn into an ongoing international incident. The United States government expressed its displeasure at the French appeal court's decision. They pointed out that the law about permanent lights on sailing vessels was a law of France, as well as a law that existed in England, but it was not an American law, and certainly not an international regulation. The United States only required sailing vessels to have permanent signal lights in ports and harbors. For the French court to have condemned an American vessel under a law in France was entirely unjust, and there was talk for some time about forcing France to reimburse Captain Durham for the lengthy amount of time he had lost due to what the American government considered a faulty prosecution. The matter would only be dropped due to the outbreak of the American Civil War, unresolved by both nations satisfactorily. Both nations felt wronged, and as though justice had been thwarted, but caught in the middle would be the families of those lost, who would also be deprived of any closure of the loss of their loved ones. For more information, please see Reynolds' Newspaper of London from December 7th, 1856, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.